In February of 1858, a slave named Reeves did something Arkansas had never seen before. He walked back into the settlement of Van Buren at dawn carrying 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and the severed badge of a bounty hunter who had chased him through the night. 12 riders had gone into the woods to capture him. Only one returned, and he could barely speak. Witnesses claimed they heard gunfire echoing for hours, as if an entire regiment were fighting a war no one understood. Others swore they saw smoke rising from the trees and a figure moving through the fog like a ghost with fire in his hands. White society across Crawford County whispered that the devil himself was hunting their men. But what they did not know was that the truth was far more terrifying than any ghost story. By the end of that week, 14 bounty hunters would be dead, and the name Reeves would become something plantation owners refused to say at night. Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Arkansas in the 1850s was a place where the river mist clung to the ground like a living thing, sliding between cypress roots and drifting across old wagon paths that looked as if they had been carved by ghosts instead of wheels. The Arkansas River Valley lay wide and humid beneath a pale winter sun, its banks coated with red clay that stained boots, hands, and memories. Travelers said the land felt watchful. Slaves said it felt hungry. What none of them knew was that deep in that silence, within that thick, breathing fog, a boy named Reeves was already becoming something the land itself could not contain. The Reeves plantation sat on a rise overlooking the river, its wooden columns warped from years of storms, its fields endless and heavy with cotton that seemed to drink sweat like water. Overseers rode through the rows with rifles across their saddles and tobacco on their breath, muttering orders heard even when he pretended he did not. He was a boy then, no more than 10, but already broader in the shoulders than most men twice his age. People whispered about that. They whispered even more about the way he watched everything. Base's eyes were his true strength long before his hands ever were. He noticed the smallest changes, the knot tied around a mule's halter, the angle of a wagon wheel in the mud, the direction smoke leaned when the wind changed. Older slaves would sometimes laugh quietly and say, "That child see the world 3 times over." But the laughter never lasted. Even they felt uneasy under the weight of his silent, calculating stare. Base did not speak unless spoken to. He did not smile unless he meant it. And he remembered everything. One cold morning, the kind that painted the plantation roofs with frost, Base walked beside an older man named January. The man's beard had gone silver long before Base was born, and the creases in his skin had deepened from too many years under too many suns. "You keep looking round like the trees gone talk to you," January murmured without turning his head. Base didn't answer at first. He was watching the river, a slow coil of gray water sliding past as if eavesdropping on every secret the land carried. "They already do," Base finally said. January stopped walking. His breath puffed white in the cold. "Boy, you be careful speaking things like that. Words make enemies quicker than fists." Base looked up at him, eyes dark and steady. "I ain't afraid of enemies." January leaned closer. "You should be. Especially the ones riding horses behind you every day." Base didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the overseer's horse by the sound of its breath. He knew the man sitting on it had a habit of chewing the left side of his cheek until it bled. He knew every man who carried a rifle on that land and which ones would hesitate before pulling the trigger. What January could not know, not then, was that Base was cataloging every detail because he sensed a future coming that demanded it. The ground felt as if it were shifting beneath all of them. A storm would break and he would need every advantage to survive it. Inside the plantation house, where Base sometimes carried trays or polished boots, the air smelled different, like pipe smoke, sweat-soaked linen, and whiskey too expensive for the men who drank it. George Reeves, master of the estate, often lounged on a tall-backed chair, boots on the table, talking as if the world itself were a card game he played better than anyone else. Base listened quietly when he worked nearby, absorbing every word. He learned the sound of arrogance, the tone before anger, the rhythm of danger. He learned exactly how far a man like George Reeves was willing to go to protect his pride. One evening, George's wife, Jane, entered the room while Base was arranging decanters on the sideboard. Her voice was cold and brittle like ice cracking underfoot. "George, you spoil that boy. He follows you like a shadow." George smirked. "Shadow's useful. Sees things. Hears things." Jane's eyes slid toward Base. "Shadows also learn things they shouldn't." Base felt her gaze but continued his work. He wiped each glass slowly, meticulously. He never allowed his hands to tremble. The more silent he remained, the more George trusted him. The more George trusted him, the more danger Base lived in. January's warning echoed, "Words make enemies quicker than fists." But Base was learning a deeper truth. Silence could make the deadliest enemy of all. Outside the house, dusk thickened into a violet haze. Cicadas screamed in the trees, as if trying to drown out the secrets buried under the soil. Base walked toward the slave quarters with a bucket in each hand, the cold air gnawing at his knuckles. A woman named Liddy stepped out of her cabin as he passed. She looked him over, concern shadowing her eyes. "Child, you walkin' round with storms in your back." Base tilted his head. "Storms?" Liddy's voice softened. "That look folk get when they gone change something they ain't supposed to." Base said nothing. But inside, his heartbeat shifted, slower, heavier, deliberate. The land around him seemed to tighten, as if holding its breath. What Base did not know, what none of them knew, was that everything around him was already being shaped by violence he could not yet see. In the following months, men would push him too far. One night would break him. And once broken, Base Reeves would become something far more dangerous than any man riding those fields had prepared for. He walked into the shadows of the quarters, unaware that this was the last winter he would ever spend as someone else's property. The land had built many monsters, but it had never built one like him. By the time Base Reeves reached 12 years old, he knew more about the Reeves plantation than the man whose name it carried. He knew that the eastern fence had a gap wide enough for a man to slip through if he timed the patrols right. He knew the dogs were changed at midnight every third night, that the lean brindled hound feared the river and would not cross it unless whipped. He knew which overseer drank enough to doze in the saddle after dark and which one never did. He knew the places in the forest where fallen logs made natural blinds and the bend in the river where the current looked gentle but could pull a man under in seconds. He kept all of it in his head, neat and ordered, like a ledger only he could read. On a damp morning stained with fog, Base stood near the stables, brushing down a gray gelding that belonged to George Reeves. The animal's flank twitched under his touch, but he moved slowly, humming under his breath, calming it. The smell of manure, hay, and leather filled the air. A younger boy named Caleb moved beside him, lugging a bucket half his size. "You talk to beasts more than folk," Caleb muttered, sloshing water onto his own bare feet. "They listen better," Base said. Caleb snorted. "They dumb. They do what they told." Base glanced at him. "So do most men." Caleb blinked, unsure whether it was a joke. "You think too much." Base dipped the brush again, eyes on the horse's muscles. "Thinking ain't what gets folk killed." Caleb shivered, though the air wasn't that cold. "Some say it is." They worked in silence after that, but Base's attention never really rested on the horse alone. His eyes tracked everything, the way the stable door hung slightly crooked on one hinge, the glint of metal where the overseer's rifle leaned against the fence, the way the river fog rolled in thicker than usual, swallowing the base of the trees. He had noticed, over the last month, that the overseers spoke more quietly and rode more often. George Reeves had visitors nearly every week. Men with polished boots and hard eyes, men who carried maps in leather tubes and talked about borders, territories, and something called secession as if it were a new kind of storm brewing far away. Base was not supposed to listen. He listened anyway. One evening, he stood just outside the dining room door, holding a tray of fresh bottles. Inside, lamplight painted the walls gold. George Reeves sat at the head of the table, leaning back as three other white men argued about the future of the South. "They will not tell us what to do with our property," one man snapped, striking the table with his fist. The crystal trembled. "Calm yourself, Harbin," George drawled. "Yankees talk. That is what they do. Talk and preen and write speeches no one reads." "You think they will not act?" Harbin demanded. George smiled, slow and vicious. "If they act, we act harder." Laughter rolled around the table. Base kept his face blank as he stepped in, refilled glasses, and moved out. He heard enough. Enough to know something large was moving beyond the fields. Enough to know the men who owned him believed they would never pay for any sin they committed. Outside the house, January waited near the veranda, leaning on a stick. His eyes followed Base as he came down the steps. "You hear him talk about war again?" January asked quietly. Base hesitated. "They always talk." January studied him. "But you always listen." Base looked toward the dark fields. A lantern in the distance swung with an overseer's movements, bobbing like a small, nervous star. "If they go to war," Base said, "we go with him?" January sighed. "They drag us everywhere they go. Long as chains fit." Base nodded once, but something cold and defiant clicked into place inside him. The idea of traveling across land not chosen, of being marched into a conflict he did not start, felt like a chokehold on his very thoughts. He made a habit of walking the perimeter of the property when no one was watching. At first, it had been simple curiosity, a boy's fascination with boundary lines. But it had become something more deliberate as the years passed. He counted steps between oak trees. He noted where the ground turned soft and where branches could hide a full-grown man. He memorized every ditch, every dip, every low place where sound carried differently. One day, while gathering wood near the river, he paused on a bluff that overlooked the current. The water below moved slow, brown, and deceptively still. "River ain't as gentle as she look," a voice said behind him. Base turned. A woman in her 50s stood there, head wrapped in a faded cloth, arms strong from decades of work. It was Liddy again. Her gaze held the river like it held people, hard but not unkind. "She pull folk under if they ain't respect her," she said. Base looked down. "How deep is it?" "Deep enough to hide a body," Liddy replied. "Deep enough to give a man a second life, if he brave enough to let go of the bank." Base considered that. "You ever think 'bout walking in and not coming back?" Liddy's jaw tightened. "All the time." She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But you ain't a skin that for me." He didn't answer. Liddy stepped closer, dropping her voice. "Child, I seen boys like you. Quiet. Watchful. Marked. Some die quick. Some start fires so big folks still talk 'bout 'em years after." "You think I'm gone start a fire?" Base asked. "I think," Liddy said, "folk like you don't get to stay small. Even when they want to." The wind shifted, bringing with it the distant clang of metal from the blacksmith shed and the faint echo of laughter from the main house. To Base, the sounds felt like links in an invisible chain, stretched tight across his chest. That night, lying on a rough pallet in the slave quarters, he stared up at the low wooden ceiling. The room smelled of sweat, smoke, and the faint sweetness of cornbread gone stale. Outside, dogs barked in restless bursts. Somewhere, a whip cracked, followed by a muted cry cut short. Caleb turned over beside him. "You awake?" he whispered. Base didn't move. "Yeah. You think 'bout runnin'?" Caleb asked. Base's heart slowed instead of racing. "Why?" "Just wonderin' if somebody like you ever think 'bout not bein' here no more." Base watched a thin line of moonlight slip through a gap in the wall. "Every man think 'bout that," he said. "Even if he don't say it." Caleb swallowed. "You ever gone do it?" Base did not answer. He did not have to. What Caleb did not know, what Base himself barely understood, was that every step he took, every pattern he noticed, every conversation he overheard, was already serving a single purpose. The land was teaching him its secrets. The river was showing him its moods. The plantation was revealing its weaknesses. He would use all of it. Not yet, but soon. And when that moment came, when the line finally broke and Base Reeves chose to vanish into the dark, no one on that plantation would be able to say they had not been warned. They had seen the way he watched everything. They simply thought they would always be the hunters. They did not realize they were training the most dangerous prey the Arkansas frontier would ever know. By the time Base reached 15, he was no longer treated like a boy. George Reeves made sure of that. The master had a way of molding the slaves closest to him into tools he believed he owned not only in body but in mind. Some men broke under it. Some hardened. Base did something else entirely, he learned. George took him everywhere. Into town. Into hunting trips. Into meetings with men who wore pistols even when visiting a friend's porch. Base fetched cigars, poured coffee, saddled horses, polished weapons. But he also listened. And what he heard carved a cold place inside him. One warm evening in late autumn, Base stood behind George's chair on the front porch while the master met with a man named Jeremiah Colt, an overseer from a neighboring plantation known for cruelty even white men whispered about. Colt wore a hat pulled low, his beard tangled, a rifle across his lap like it was an extension of his arm. The lantern between them cast long shadows across the floorboards. "You keep that boy close," Colt grunted, jerking his chin toward Base. "Ain't seen you favor a slave like that since." "Since never," George cut in sharply. "Favor is not the word." Colt smirked. "What word then?" George leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping the wood. "Dependence, maybe. Utility. The boy's useful." Colt laughed, a low, grating sound. "Useful now. Dangerous later." George's eyes flicked sideways as if appraising Base in a way that was half pride, half threat. "He knows his place." Base stood still, expression calm, eyes on the darkness beyond the yard. He did not flinch when George said words like that. Did not blink. did not let anything crack across his face. But inside, a line tightened. Colt spat over the porch rail. I seen boys like him. Tall, quiet, sure. They snap one day. George shrugged. If he snaps, I'll put him down like any other. Bass felt the words fall like stones into his stomach. Not because they hurt. Because they confirmed something he had long known. George Reeves did not see him as a son. Or a shadow. Or even a man. He was an object. A danger contained only by obedience. Colt leaned forward, squinting through the lantern glow. Boy, he growled, you listenin'? Bass answered softly. Always. Colt's laughter cut the air. That's what I'm afraid of. George's chair scraped as he stood. Go on now, Bass. Fetch the rest of the bottles. Bass turned without a word and stepped inside the house. But as he walked through the quiet hallway, he felt something new twisting inside him. Not fear, not even anger. Calculation. The awareness that these men, who believed themselves untouchable, were watching him without understanding what they were truly seeing. Hours later, after Colt had ridden off and the sky had darkened into a deep indigo, George called Bass into his study. The room smelled of pipe smoke and warm whiskey. Maps were pinned on the walls, territories, river routes, slave patrol circuits. Bass saw everything at a glance. George poured himself another drink. Bass, he said calmly, you know why I keep you close? Bass kept his gaze steady. Because you ain't got to repeat yourself with me. George chuckled. True. But that ain't all. He stepped closer, so close the whiskey on his breath hit Bass like heat. You make men uneasy. That can be a powerful thing. Bass did not respond. George circled behind him, voice low. But power cuts both ways. Never forget that. Bass waited silent. George's tone sharpened. Colt was right about one thing. A boy like you could become a problem. He paused, letting the words hang. But only if you choose to. Bass felt the tension, a cold thread pulling tight beneath his ribs. I ain't chose nothing. George nodded slowly. Good. Keep it that way. A moment passed. Then George dismissed him with a flick of his fingers. Go on now. I am done with you tonight. Bass stepped outside into the cool Arkansas night. The air buzzed with cicadas. Smoke drifted from the chimneys like thin gray ghosts. And across the yard, he saw January sitting alone on a bench, eyes on the moon. January gestured him over. Sit, child. Bass sat. You heard things tonight? January asked. Enough. January rubbed his hands together, worn palms rasping like sandpaper. George watching you too hard. That Colt man too. That means something. Bass didn't reply. January leaned closer. Men like them don't fear boys. They fear futures. Bass looked at him sharply. January nodded. They look at you and see a future they can't control. Bass lifted his eyes toward the distant tree line where darkness pooled between the branches. I ain't thinking about futures. January gave a humorless smile. You will. World don't give you a choice. A sudden shout shattered the quiet, an overseer cursing somewhere near the barns. A whip cracked once, twice. A short scream followed. Bass's muscles tensed instinctively, jaw tightening. You hear that? January whispered. Bass didn't answer. January sighed. One day you gon' have to choose what man you gon' be. George's tool, or something else. Something they ain't ready for. Bass looked down at his hands, large, calloused, scarred from years of rope and steel and earth. Hands that could break a man if pushed too far. I ain't breaking nothin', he murmured. January gave him a long look. Not yet. The moon hung low, casting pale silver across the yard. Bass rose slowly, each step deliberate, controlled. He walked back toward the quarters with the calm gait of someone who appeared obedient, docile, harmless. But inside, every word, every threat, every warning from Colt and George echoed like a drumbeat. Useful. Dangerous. Put him down. They saw a tool. They did not see the storm forming inside him. And what Bass Reeves did not know, what none of them could possibly know, was that the night he would be forced to defend himself was already moving toward him like a shadow sliding across the land. When it finally arrived, it would change everything. And no man, not even George Reeves, would ever forget it. By the spring of 1860, the Reeves plantation pulsed with tension, like heat trapped under iron. War talk drifted through every gathering of white men, and the slaves felt it the way animals sense a coming storm. A shift in the air, a tightening in the lungs, a hum beneath the soil. The world was changing, but on the surface, life went on with its cruel routines. Field work, lashes, fear, and the endless pretending that nothing would ever change. But Base saw cracks forming everywhere. George Reeves spent more nights drinking, more nights gambling, more nights filling his house with men who wore their violence like perfume. These gatherings always started with laughter and ended with arguments, slurred accusations, and fists slamming into tables hard enough to rattle every bottle on them. Base hated those nights, not because of the work, they had worked him all his life, but because those men watched him too closely. They eyed him like a wild animal someone had brought into a parlor as a trick. They studied the width of his shoulders, the calm in his eyes, the stillness in his hands. It unsettled them. And unsettled men were dangerous. One night in early May, the house glowed with lamplight as thunder rolled far off over the river. The air smelled of whiskey and wood smoke, thick enough to taste. Base stood in the dining room, placing decanters on the sideboard while George Reeves dealt cards to a table littered with coins, pistols, and cigar ash. 4 men sat with him: Captain Rusk, Ellis Harbin, Jonah Pierce, and a young militia lieutenant named Cooper. Their coats lay tossed over chairs, their collars open, their voices rising with the heat of the game. "Your turn, George," Pierce muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. George grinned, a mean grin that twisted as he lifted his cards. "Well now, gentlemen, I believe I just ruined your evening." Harbin groaned. "Not again." Rusk spat into the corner. "Man cheats." George laughed. "If I cheat, it is because you too blind to see it." They roared with drunken approval. Base moved quietly beside them, refilling glasses with steady hands. Lieutenant Cooper glanced up at him. "That boy's a quiet one." Harbin snorted. "Quiet boys are the ones you watch." George smirked. "Base don't cause trouble. Do you, boy?" Base set down a bottle, eyes lowering. "No, sir." George flicked a card at him. "See? Obedient." Cooper leaned forward. "He yours by blood or by purchase?" The table stilled. George's jaw tightened. "Purchase." Cooper's eyes narrowed. "He don't look at you like most slaves look at their masters." Base didn't move. Harbin chuckled. "No. He looks at a man like he weighing him." Rusk added, "One day that boy gon' be a problem." Base felt the words travel through him like heat. George waved dismissively. "He knows better." Cooper smirked. "Does he?" Base stepped back, but his pulse drummed in his ears. He had learned to let insults slide off him like rain off stone. But something about Cooper's tone, its arrogance, its challenge, cut deeper than usual. George slapped his cards down. "Deal again." But Cooper wasn't done. "Boy," he said, voice rising, "bring me the bottle on the mantel." Base walked toward the fireplace, aware of the eyes tracking him. As he reached for the bottle, Cooper spoke again, louder. "Ever play cards, boy?" Base said nothing. Cooper laughed. "Bet you have. Bet you've been watching us all night, memorizing every move." Base held the bottle. "Want this or something else?" Cooper leaned back in his chair. "I want to know whether you think you smarter than us." George growled, "Enough." But Cooper pressed, eager for trouble. "Come on, George. Let him answer." Base placed the bottle in front of Cooper, his voice calm but cold. "Ain't smart to think about things that ain't my place." Cooper grinned, ugly and triumphant. "Hear that? He thinkin' plenty." Rusk laughed. "Boys got fire." "Fire gets men killed," Harbin muttered. George slammed a palm on the table. "I said enough." A brief silence fell. Then the cards were dealt again, the whiskey poured again, and the tension shifted into something more volatile. Hours passed. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The game grew louder, more desperate. Money piled in the center of the table. Voices rose. Base poured another glass for George. The master's eyes were bloodshot, movements sloppy. Cooper pointed a shaking finger at Base. "Bet the boy cheating somehow. Watching every damn card we play." George's head snapped up. "What you say?" "I said maybe he's signaling," Cooper slurred. "Maybe he ain't as dumb as you think." Base felt the air change. The moment thickened. Something dangerous hovered. George stood slowly, swaying slightly. "Boy," he said, voice icy, "step forward." Base did. George stared at him, eyes narrowed. "You cheat my table?" "No, sir." Cooper smirked. "He lying." George grabbed Base by the collar, pulling him close. His breath reeked of whiskey. "You cheat me?" "No." George's grip tightened. "You cheat me?" Base's pulse thudded once, heavily. "I ain't touched your cards." George shoved him back, stumbling. Rage flared across his face, sudden and wild. "You think you smarter than me? Think you can stand behind me and judge me?" Harbin stood. George. But George was past hearing. He drew back his fist and struck Base hard across the jaw. Base staggered. He did not fall. He lifted his head, eyes locked on George's. And in that brief, electric moment, the room changed. Everyone felt it, the shift, the danger, the line that could never be walked back over again. Rusk muttered, "Oh hell?" George shouted, "Don't you look at me like that." He swung again. Base caught his wrist midair. The table went silent. Lightning flashed through the window. George froze, breath halted, eyes widening with shock. Base released him, slowly, deliberately. Cooper whispered, "Lord, he ain't scared of you." Base stepped back. "You drunk." "I ain't fightin' a drunk man." George shook with humiliation and fury. "Get out," he hissed, voice trembling. "Get out before I put a bullet in you." Base turned and walked out the door into the storm-soaked night. Rain poured over him in sheets. Thunder cracked like gunfire. The world seemed to split open. He walked toward the quarters, fists clenched, breath tight. What he did not know, what none inside that house knew, was that George Reeves was already calling for his rifle. The hunt would begin before sunrise. And Base Reeves's life would never be the same again. Rain hammered the earth long after Base left the house that night. It soaked the fields, sluiced mud down the slopes, and washed the dust from wagon ruts as if the sky itself meant to clear a path. Thunder rolled low across the Arkansas River, shaking the windows of every building on the plantation. Base walked through it without flinching, water dripping from his hair, the taste of metal rising in the back of his throat. He knew what was coming. He had seen the look in George Reeves's eyes, that trembling fury of a man who had been shamed in front of others, a man who believed his authority ordained by God. There were two kinds of white men in the South, those who punished slaves out of habit, and those who punished them out of humiliation. The second kind were always the most dangerous. Base pushed open the door of the slave quarters. January sat near the fire, mending a worn boot. Liddy stirred a pot of beans with quiet motions. Caleb slept nearby, curled on a straw pallet. January looked up, eyes narrowing. Storm out there wild tonight. Base stood dripping in the doorway. George drunk. January's hands paused on the boot. His voice dropped low. "What he do?" "Hit me." The room froze. Liddy turned, spoon midair. "Child, did you raise your hand?" Base shook his head. "Just caught his." January's face tightened with dread. "Lord have mercy." Liddy placed the pot aside and stepped toward him, voice trembling. "You come in here with a storm behind you. Tell me you ain't done nothing foolish." Base met her eyes. "I ain't start a thing." January's voice cracked. "But you ended something, didn't you?" Base didn't speak. "You didn't have to." The room felt the truth vibrating off him like heat off coals. January stood, moving with urgency. "Pack something. Anything. You got minutes, not hours." Base blinked. "He Callan the patrol?" "He Callan every man with a gun and a reason to kill you," January hissed. "You don't get to stay here no more." Base took a step back, the weight of it sinking in. Leaving meant severing everything. This land, the small community that had raised him, the faces that knew him since birth. But staying meant death. Liddy grabbed his arm. "You hear me, boy? You gone run. You hear?" Base nodded once. "Good," she whispered. "Then run like the devil himself after you." Base turned to leave, but January caught his shoulder. "Take my knife." Base looked down. A long, curved blade rested in January's calloused palm. The handle wrapped in old leather, the edge sharpened to a thin, merciless gleam. "I ain't got the strength no more to use it," January said softly. "But you gon' need it before dawn." Base took it, feeling its weight settle into his hand like something inevitable. Liddy shoved a small cloth bundle at him, cornbread, jerky, a flint. "Go. Now, don't look back." Base stepped outside just as a lantern flared behind him. An overseer shouted from the direction of the big house. Another voice answered. The storm masked some of the sound, but Base recognized the panic in Liddy's voice as she shut the door behind him. He sprinted into the trees, mud splashing up his legs, branches clawing at his clothes. The rain slowed the world, turning every sound into a whisper or a roar. His breath punched in and out, steady, controlled. He moved like someone who had been preparing for this moment all his life, because he had. Behind him, dogs barked. Riders shouted. Gunshots cracked through the storm. Base didn't look back. He cut through the woods, feet finding familiar paths even in the dark. He knew where the land dipped, where roots twisted like traps, where the river could offer cover. He followed instinct sharpened by years of watching. But the dogs were closing in. He heard their snarls, the frantic pounding of paws through the mud. Torches bobbed behind the trees, shadows of men on horseback yelling curses drowned by thunder. Base ducked beneath a fallen log, crawling through briars until he reached the slope above the river. The rain turned the ground slick beneath his feet. He slid down the bank and crouched low, listening. Voices grew louder. "There?" someone shouted. "I seen movement." Base swallowed the rising heat in his throat. He could outrun them only so long. He had to disappear. He pressed his hand to the mud, whispering to himself, "Now." He plunged into the river. Cold water engulfed him. It bit at his skin, dragged at his limbs. The current tugged him under, spinning him in darkness. He surfaced once, silent, just enough to fill his lungs before letting the river pull him again. Above him, lantern lights flickered along the riverbank. Dog lost the scent. Find him. Go upstream. Boy's dead if he in that water. Base drifted beneath overhanging branches, clinging to a broken limb. He let the current carry him several hundred yards before he crawled to shore, gasping. The forest was darker here, thicker. He climbed up the bank and stumbled toward a clearing, but froze at the sound of hoofbeats. A single rider. Alone. Moving slowly. Base crouched behind a cedar tree, hand slipping to January's knife. The rider dismounted, lantern swinging. The man cursed under his breath. "Reeves gone, skin me alive if I come back empty." Base recognized the voice. Riley, a patrolman known for cruelty. He paced the clearing, scowling. "You out here, boy?" Riley called into the dark. "You think you gon' live long out here?" Silence answered. Riley lifted his lantern, squinting. "Ain't no one outrun." Base moved. Fast. Silent. Final. He stepped from behind the cedar like a shadow pulled loose from the trunk. The rain swallowed the sound of his feet. Riley turned too late, eyes widening, mouth opening, but the knife was already there, flashing once in the dim lantern glow. Base drove it into Riley's throat. The man gagged, dropping the lantern, hands flailing against Base's shoulders. Base held him until his body went slack, then lowered him gently to the ground. The lantern hissed out in the mud. Base stood over the body, chest heaving, rain dripping from his face. His first kill. Necessary. Unwanted. Unavoidable. Thunder cracked above him like a judgment. Base wiped the blade, took the man's revolver, his canteen, his thin roll of tobacco. Then he stepped back into the forest, the storm swallowing him whole. What he did not know was that Riley's absence would ignite a fury George Reeves had never unleashed before. By dawn, more riders would gather. More dogs. More rifles. The hunt had only begun. And Base Reeves, blood on his hands for the first time, walked deeper into the night with the calm of a man who understood that he had crossed a line he could never return from. By sunrise, Base was miles from the Reeves plantation, but the danger had not loosened its grip. Rain still clung to the branches, dripping in slow, steady taps. Mist wound between the trees, curling around trunks like pale smoke. The air smelled of wet pine and clay. Base moved with purpose, but exhaustion gnawed at the edges of his vision. He had been running for hours, running from dogs, from riders, from death. But now the forest grew different. Quieter. Older. The trees here were massive, their roots coiled deep into the earth like they fed on secrets. Birds called in short, wary bursts. Something in the air shifted. Not danger, but a kind of watchfulness he had never felt before. Base followed a narrow deer trail until he reached a clearing where sunlight lanced through the canopy in thin gold bars. He staggered, leaning against a fallen log, chest heaving. Blood smeared the handle of January's knife, Riley's blood. The weight of what he'd done settled on him like mud on boots. He had killed a man. For the first time, Base allowed himself to feel it. Then he heard the sound, soft, deliberate footsteps. Not riders. Not dogs. People. He turned slowly, muscles tightening, ready for another fight. 3 figures emerged from the trees, bows raised, arrows notched. Their faces were solemn, their expressions unreadable. Their clothing, woven cloth, leather, beadwork, marked them as Choctaw. Their presence here meant he had crossed far beyond white patrol territory. One of them, a tall man with braids down his back, studied Base with unsettling calm. "Lay down the blade," the man said, not in English but in Choctaw. Base understood none of the words. But he understood the gesture when the man pointed his arrow straight at his chest. Base lowered the knife, slow, steady, placing it on the ground. The tall man stepped closer, eyes scanning the blood on Base's shirt. "You hunted." Base shook his head. "I'm the one being hunted." The man nodded once as if he had expected that answer. Then he motioned to the others. They lowered their bows but did not relax. The tall man switched to rough English. You run from white men. Yes. You kill one? Base hesitated. Had to. The man's expression didn't change. Come. Base frowned. Why? Because the forest choose not to kill you, the man said. That means something. Base did not argue. He could barely stand. He followed them deeper into the woods until they reached a small village tucked between the trees. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children darting between cabins, dogs trotting alertly. The settlement felt alive but not fragile, as if it had roots older than the plantations Base had grown up on. A woman hurried over, speaking quickly to the tall man. He pointed at Base, explaining in Choctaw. The woman nodded, then beckoned Base toward a firelit shelter. Sit, she said firmly. Base sat. His muscles trembled with fatigue. She examined his arm, finding a long gash he hadn't even realized he'd taken while running. She cleaned it with warm water, herbs, and steady hands. You strong? She murmured. Base didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes, letting the warmth seep into him. The tall man stood on the other side of the shelter, arms crossed. My name is Yehola. Base opened his eyes. Base. Yehola nodded. You stay here. You heal. Base frowned. Why you help me? Yehola paused, gaze sharpening. Because we know white men's cruelty. Because we seen slaves run into the woods, hunted like animals. He stepped closer. And because you not afraid. Base met his eyes. Fear ain't got time to catch me. Yehola gave the smallest hint of a smile. Good. For weeks, Base stayed among the Choctaw. He healed. He learned. He watched the same way he had always watched. The Choctaw noticed. An elder named Oki took an interest in him. The old man moved with the slowness of age but carried a sharpness in his eyes that Base recognized instantly. This was a man who saw everything. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the treetops, Oki called Base to sit with him near a dying fire. You hear forest, Oki said. You hear river. That why you live. Base shrugged. I listen. Oki shook his head. Not listen. Understand. Base didn't argue. The old man wasn't wrong. Oki picked up a bough, carving the wood with a small blade. Why you run? Base stared into the fire. I ain't got choice. Oki's eyes narrowed. Always choice. Even when both choices bad. Base didn't know how to answer that. Oki pointed to the horizon. You kill a man. Now more men come. Base stiffened. They will. Then you must learn fight their way, Oki said, and learn fight different way. What that mean? Oki tossed a handful of dirt onto the fire, causing sparks to burst upward. White men loud. They ride loud. They shoot loud. They die loud. And me? You quiet, Oki said. Quiet is stronger. Base absorbed that. In the months that followed, Yehola and other Choctaw hunters taught Base what silence looked like. How to move through underbrush without snapping branches. How to read wind by smell alone. How to fire a rifle without flinching. How to track a man by the way he placed his foot in mud. One Choctaw marksman named Apidi tested Base every dusk, setting up targets in the woods at impossible distances. Shoot, Apidi would say. Base missed at first. Not for long. Within weeks, he hit every target. Apidi raised an eyebrow. You Choctaw now, he said lightly. Shoot better than me. Base shook his head. Just see clear. Apidi grinned. Then see this. He tossed a small clay disc into the air. Base fired once. The disc shattered mid-flight. The village fell silent, then murmured in astonishment. Apidi clapped him on the back. Ghost eyes, he said. You see what others don't. But Base also learned another skill, one more dangerous than shooting or tracking. He learned how to disappear. How to blend into the woods until his presence became a rumor, a suggestion, a shadow cast by a tree. He learned patience. He learned control. He learned the land in ways no overseer or slave patrol could ever understand. But the forest, always the forest, held a warning. One evening, Oki sat beside him again. His voice was soft, almost sorrowful. You learn good, Oki said. Too good. Base frowned. What that mean? Oki tapped Base's chest. Storm in here. Storm move with you. One day storm break. Men die. Many. Base swallowed, throat tightening. I don't want kill nobody. Oki shook his head. Storm don't ask what you want. The word struck him harder than any fist. Base slept poorly that night. Dreams swirled. Torches, dogs, splashing water, Riley's face fading beneath the rain. When he woke at dawn, Yehola stood beside him, grave. "A man come," Yehola said. "White man. Badge on coat." He looked for runaway slave. Base's pulse quickened. Yehola's voice darkened. "He not alone." Base sat up. "How many?" "5." Base clenched his jaw. The storm Oki warned about was already walking toward him. And Base Reeves would not be the one dying in the dirt. The hunters were coming. And this time, Base had become something they were not prepared to face. They came at dusk. 5 bounty hunters crossing the border of Choctaw territory like men who believed no land, no people, no law applied to them. Their boots crushed wet leaves. Their horses snorted in the cooling evening air. Their coats were stiff with old dust and dried sweat. The leader, a thick-jawed man with a scar splitting his eyebrow, rode at the front with a badge pinned crooked on his chest. The metal glinted red in the sinking sun like something blood-soaked. Base watched them from above, hidden between the branches of a blackjack oak. Yehola crouched beside him, silent as bark. Below, the hunters moved slowly, scanning the trees. The scarred leader pointed. "Tracks. Big ones. Close." Base's pulse stayed calm. Years of watching overseers had taught him how hunters thought. The Choctaw had taught him how hunters died. Yehola whispered, "We warned them not to enter." Base nodded. "They ain't the warning kind." The lead hunter halted his horse and cupped his hands, shouting into the forest, "Base Reeves. Come out now and you die quick. Make us work, you die slow." The woods swallowed his voice. Yehola exhaled once. "You ready?" Base's jaw tightened. "Been ready since the river." Yehola placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, grounding. "Kill only what you must." Base nodded once. 5 men ain't no more than must. They slipped down from the branches as quiet as falling mist. Base moved ahead, circling, letting the forest fold around him. He stepped into shadows thick enough to hide a breath. A PD had once told him, "When you fight, you are not man. You are silence." Base lived that lesson now. Every movement a whisper, every inhale measured. The bounty hunters dismounted near a hollow, tying their horses. One knelt, touching the ground. "Fresh mud on the prints," he said. "He passed through here today." Scar Eye spat. "Good. We end this tonight." Base watched them spread out. They thought they were hunting him. But Base was no longer the boy who fled through rain with dogs at his heels. He was something shaped by a year of hard learning, tracking, patience, precision. And he carried the forest inside him. He waited until one hunter stepped over the fallen log, exactly where Base had laid the trap. A thin vine snapped. The man froze. Then the snare whipped upward, yanking him into the air by the ankle. He howled, dangling, rifle dropping uselessly to the ground. "What the?" "Cut him down." Scar Eye barked. 2 hunters rushed forward. Base stepped from the shadows behind them. The first never saw the knife coming. Base drove the blade up through the ribs, fast, efficient. The man staggered, breath collapsing in his chest. The second spun, drawing his pistol, but Base was already moving. He seized the man's wrist, twisting until bones cracked, then slammed his head into the trunk of a hickory tree. He dropped like a kicked sack. Scar Eye shouted, firing blindly into the trees. Yehola's arrow struck his forearm, knocking the shot wide. The scarred man screamed, dropping his pistol. "Damn natives. Boy ain't worth." Base charged him. Scar Eye swung a hunting knife, but Base ducked low, drove forward, and tackled him into the dirt. They rolled, mud splashing, limbs thrashing. Scar Eye was strong, seasoned, desperate. He slammed his elbow into Base's jaw, grabbed for Base's throat. Base broke his grip and locked his forearm against the man's windpipe. Scar Eye choked, clawing at Base's arm. You think you something?" he rasped. Base didn't answer. Scar Eye gurgled, gasping. You ain't worth." Base squeezed harder. The man went still. Base stood, chest heaving. Mud streaked his arms. Blood smeared his hands, but his eyes were cold, steady. The last hunter, the one caught in the snare, still dangled from the tree, kicking, screaming. "Help. Cut me down. Please." Yehola stepped into the clearing, bow drawn. But Base raised a hand. "No," Base said quietly. "He's mine." He approached the man slowly. Rain dripped from the leaves overhead, pattering softly on the ground. "You ride into Choctaw land," Base said, voice low. "You hunt me." The man shook violently. I was just following orders, George Reeves sent." Base's expression didn't change. "I ain't his no more." He cut the vine. The man crashed hard onto his back, wheezing from the impact. Base kneeled beside him, gripping the front of his coat. "You find me," Base said. "Tell him what you saw." The man blinked. What? Base leaned close enough that their foreheads nearly touched. "Tell him I ain't runnin' scared. Tell him I ain't dyin' in no river or under no tree. Tell him next man they send better be ready to meet his maker." The hunter nodded frantically, terror flooding his eyes. Base released him. Yehola watched quietly as the man scrambled to his feet and fled into the woods, stumbling, sobbing. "You let him live," Yehola said softly. Base stared into the trees. "Let him speak." Yehola nodded, understanding. Not mercy, strategy. The bodies were dragged deep into the forest and buried under fallen leaves. The horses were untied and sent running in opposite directions, disappearing into the night like ghosts scattering on command. By the time the moon rose high, the forest had gone still again. Yehola placed a hand on Base's shoulder. "You hunted tonight." Base's eyes darkened. "No." He looked toward the path where the surviving bounty hunter had fled. "They hunted me." Yehola studied him for a long moment. "Oki was right. Storm in you." Base didn't deny it. Oki's warning echoed. "Storm, don't ask what you want." Base Reeves exhaled slowly. "Storm already here." And somewhere far beyond the trees, the word of what Base had done would soon reach ears that could not endure shame. More men would come. Many more. And Base was ready. The survivor from Choctaw land did not stop riding until his horse nearly collapsed beneath him. He burst into Van Buren wild-eyed and mud-splattered, stumbling into the sheriff's office with blood on his collar and terror stamped across his face. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Wardell Briggs, looked up from his desk with irritation that melted into something colder when he saw the fear in the hunter's eyes. "What happened to you?" Briggs demanded. The hunter shook, swallowing hard. "It's him," he whispered. "That slave. Reeves. He ain't right." Briggs frowned. "Speak plain." The man's voice cracked. "4 of us went in. I'm the only one come out. He killed him like he'd done it 100 times. Silent. Fast." He shuddered. "Forest moved with him. Like it wanted us dead." Briggs stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached for his hat. "Get cleaned up. Drink something strong. Then you and me go see George Reeves." By nightfall, word had reached the plantation. George Reeves listened without speaking as the hunter stammered through the story. His hands clenched the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles paled. The lamp on his desk threw his face into hard lines, carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. "You're telling me," George said slowly, "my runaway slave killed 4 armed men and walked away?" The hunter nodded frantically. "I swear." "And you," George continued, voice sharpening, "you came back empty-handed. No body. No proof. Nothing but a tale." The man swallowed. "You can go see the graves." George surged to his feet, slamming a fist into the desk. "I will not go see anything. I will end it." He turned to Sheriff Briggs, who sat in the corner, hat in his lap, watching carefully. 13 men, George said. "I want 13 riders. Best you got. Men who don't flinch. Men who don't ask questions." Briggs hesitated. "That many for one fugitive?" George's eyes burned. "This ain't about one fugitive. This about message. If word spreads that one slave can kill white men on our own land and walk free, we lose more than a man. We lose the hold." Briggs knew he was right. By dawn, 13 riders were gathered in front of the Reeves house. Their faces were hard, their rifles polished, their pistols loaded. Some were bounty hunters. Some were deputies. A few were simply violent men eager for the coin and the excuse to spill blood. George stood on the porch, eyes cold. "You bring him back to me," he said. "Dead or alive. Do not come back without him." The scarred hunter, the one who had survived the first encounter, rode among them, jaw clenched. He held his fear tight behind his teeth. "He ain't natural," he muttered to the man beside him. "Forest on his side." The other man snorted. "Forest bleed same as men." But as they rode toward Choctaw land, through fog that clung to the horses' legs and trees that loomed like silent witnesses, even the bravest among them felt a prickle between their shoulders. They did not know it, but every hoofbeat carried them deeper into a design not their own, because Base Reeves had already heard they were coming. The surviving hunter's story, meant to warn, had traveled in the other direction as well. Traders spoke too freely. A Choctaw boy overheard in town and ran the words home like a spark carried on the wind. "Many men," the boy told Yehola breathlessly. 13. With guns. Yehola found Base sitting near the river, cleaning a rifle with slow, methodical care. "It is time," Yehola said. Base's jaw flexed. How many? 13. Base's hands did not stop moving. He slid the cleaning rod back into place, checked the sight, ran his thumb along the barrel. They want to end it. Yahola's gaze hardened. Then we end them first. Base looked up, eyes dark and quiet. I ain't a skin you to fight my war. Yahola shook his head. This not just your war. White men cross our border with guns, hunt on our land, that make it our war too. Base watched the river, the water sliding past, indifferent to human rage. Then we ain't meet 'em head on. Of course not, Yahola said. We meet them like forest meets fire. Base rose slowly. You burn him out. Piece by piece, Yahola replied. They moved quickly. Over the next hours, Base and a handful of Choctaw warriors laid out a path of death across miles of forest. They knew the terrain as intimately as Base knew the plantation. Every ravine, every narrow pass, every stretch of soft ground that could swallow a horse's leg. They felled 2 slender trees across a narrow trail, making it look like storm damage. They dug a shallow pit in a tight bend, covering it with branches. They stretched a nearly invisible line of rawhide across a low rise where a galloping horse's legs would catch. And Base chose his perches, high ground with clear lines of sight, places where his rifle could speak before any man knew where the bullet came from. He moved with a cold calm that would have frightened January and Liddy if they had seen it. This was not the boy they had warned and fed and tried to protect. This was the storm Oki had spoken of. Late afternoon they heard them. The rider's approach broke the forest quiet like a crude song, hooves pounding, men talking too loud, bridles clinking, leather creaking. They came in a tight column, thinking numbers alone made them invincible. The first shot shattered that belief. Base waited until the lead rider passed under the overhanging limb where he lay prone, body pressed against the bark. He exhaled, slow and careful, the way Apidi had taught him. Then he squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked softly against his shoulder. Below, the lead rider jerked backward and toppled from the saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Panic rippled down the line. Sniper. Where? A second shot cracked from another angle, Yahola's rifle. Another man dropped, clutching his chest. The horses screamed and reared, eyes rolling white. Spread out. Find 'em. Briggs shouted, spurring his horse forward. But spreading out only made them easier to pick apart. One man galloped ahead, cursing, looking for cover. His horse hit the rawhide line Base had stretched. The animal pitched forward, sending man and beast crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and metal. The rider didn't rise. Another tried to wheel left, away from the chaos, only to have his horse's front legs plunge into the camouflaged pit. The animal shrieked, trapped. The man's legs snapped with a sickening crack as he fell. He screamed for mercy. The forest gave none. Shots rang from tree lines, from ridges, from shadows. Men fired wildly into the brush, hitting nothing. They were used to hunting terrified runaways who crashed through the woods blindly. They were not used to being the prey. Base moved positions between shots, never firing twice from the same spot, never lingering. He watched faces, not uniforms. He marked which men barked orders and which froze in place. Leaders died first. Briggs tried to rally them, shouting, "Form a line. Form a." Base's bullet took his hat clean off, grazing his scalp. Blood streaked his forehead. He toppled from the saddle, stunned but alive. He crawled toward a fallen log as chaos swallowed the clearing. By the time the sun slid low and the trees turned to black silhouettes, 11 men lay dead or dying on the forest floor. 2 remained. One bolted, stumbling through the undergrowth, leaving his horse behind. He crashed through branches, breath ragged, eyes wild. A root snagged his boot. He fell hard, scraping his face. He scrambled up and kept running, deeper into a darkness that felt alive. Base watched him go. He could have shot him. He did not. The last man was Briggs, half delirious, bleeding, crawling on his hands and knees toward the faint glow of open land beyond the trees. His breath came in harsh sobs. His fingers dug into moss and mud. "Help," he rasped to no one. "God, help." Base stepped out from behind a tree and stood over him. Briggs flinched, trying to pull his pistol. His hand shook too much to grip it. Base nudged it away with his boot. "You came a long way," Base said quietly. Briggs stared up at him, fear and disbelief warring in his eyes. You're just a..." "The word you lookin' for," Base said, voice calm as river water, "ain't one you should use when you crawl into..." Briggs swallowed, chest heaving. "You gon' kill me?" Base considered him for a long, silent moment. Then he stepped back. "You go home," he said. "Tell him what you seen. Tell him you rode in 13 strong and crawled out alone. Briggs shook his head, stunned. Why let me live? Base's gaze was flat. Fear traveled faster than bodies. He turned and walked into the trees. Behind him, Sheriff Briggs dragged himself toward the fading light, each movement leaving a smear of blood on the ground. He would make it back to civilization. He would live long enough to speak. And every word he spoke would turn Base Reeves from a fugitive into a legend whispered in terror. What Briggs did not know was that the story would not end with his survival. Because Base was not done. Not with him. Not with Arkansas. Not with the name Reeves. Dawn crawled over Van Buren like a tired man rising from a bad dream. The sky was a washed-out gray, streaked with thin pink veins. The Arkansas River moved slow and heavy beside the town, its surface catching the first weak light. Wagons creaked along the main road. A sleepy mule brayed somewhere behind a livery. The world looked ordinary, small, worn, half awake. No one expected the ghost to walk in. Base Reeves stepped out of the river fog wearing a weathered coat that did not belong to him and boots that had once belonged to a man now buried under Choctaw leaves. Mud darkened his trousers to the knee. A rifle hung over one shoulder, a second strapped across his back. 2 pistols rested at his hips. Beneath the coat, January's knife lay sheathed against his spine. Pinned to a strip of torn leather in his hand was a badge. Sheriff Briggs' badge. He walked up the main street with the slow, unhurried gait of a man who had already made peace with whatever waited for him. The few people awake at that hour noticed him first as a shape, tall, broad, alone. Then their eyes sharpened. Someone gasped. Is that? No. Can't be. Thought he was dead. A shopkeeper froze halfway through lifting a crate, knuckles whitening. A woman sweeping her porch dropped her broom, bristles scraping the boards. A young boy, eyes wide, tugged on his father's sleeve. Pa, that's him. That's the one. The father swallowed. Get inside. Doors shut quietly as Base passed, but curtains rustled. Faces peeked out and ducked back. The air thickened with whispers. Base Reeves. Thought they sent half the county after him. He looked like a man come from a war, not a whipping. Base did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed ahead, where the sheriff's office sat squat and ugly at the end of the street. A lantern still burned inside despite the morning light, its glow a dull ember behind dirty glass. He pushed the door open. The hinges squealed. Inside, Deputy Miller sat behind the desk, hat low over his eyes, a half-finished cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up with annoyance that broke into pure disbelief. The cup slipped from his fingers and smashed on the floor. Sweet Lord, he whispered. You're supposed to be dead. Base stepped inside, letting the door swing closed behind him. The room smelled of stale tobacco, ink, and fear. I heard the same about you folk, Base said quietly. Miller scrambled to his feet, hand flying toward the revolver at his hip, then freezing. Because now that his mind caught up with his eyes, he saw everything. The rifles, the pistols, the calm in Base's gaze that did not belong to a desperate runaway. It belonged to a man who had seen what lay on the other side of fear and come back with his hands full of it. You can't be here, Miller stammered. This town ain't. Base raised his hand. The strip of leather with the badge dangled from his fingers. Miller stared. That Sheriff Briggs? Base dropped it on the desk. The metal clinked once, then lay still, its shine dull, edges nicked. Blood had dried along one side in a faint brown smear. Miller paled. Where'd you? Forrest, Base said. Where you sent him. Miller swallowed hard. You kill him? Not that day, Base replied. Forrest did plenty without me. Miller licked his lips, eyes darting to the door. George Reeves, he gone? He ain't here yet, Base said. You are. The deputy's mind raced. He weighed options, gun, shout, run. Each option died under the weight of one simple truth. If Base had wanted him dead, he would already be lying on the floor. What do you want? Miller whispered. Base's gaze moved slowly around the room. The barred window, the keys hanging on a nail, the rows of wanted posters curling at the corners. Black ink on cheap paper. Names. Bounties. Human lives traded for coin. He returned his eyes to Miller. I want you to hear me. So when men ask what happened, your tongue don't stumble. Miller nodded shakily. You tell him 13 rode out, Base said. You tell him they crossed into land that ain't theirs. You tell him they aimed guns at a man already pushed too far. He paused. Tell him they ain't come back. Miller's jaw worked. You lettin' me live, just to talk? Base tilted his head. Talk all you good at. A flicker of anger sparked in Miller's eyes, but it died under Base's stare. What about Sheriff Briggs? He asked. He's still out there? Bass remembered Briggs crawling through the dirt, blood in his hair, eyes full of something broken. He remembered turning away. He remembered the choice. He alive last I saw, Bass said. Whether he stay that way, that on him. Miller sank slowly back into his chair. You know they gone, send more after you. Men from Little Rock. Maybe from Texas. Ain't just 'bout George anymore. White folks ain't gone stand for this. You humiliate 'em, you kill men with badges, they gone come like wolves. Bass's mouth curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. Wolves bleed same as dogs. Miller shivered. Outside, hoofbeats sounded on the street. Voices rose. The town was waking to the fact that something unnatural was happening. A fugitive walking free, speaking calmly in the lion's den. Miller's eyes darted to the window. Reeves could be here any minute. Bass turned toward the door. Good thing I ain't planning to stay. Miller blurted, why come here at all? Why not just disappear? Bass paused with his hand on the handle. 'Cause disappearing only helped me, he said. This, help memory. Miller frowned. Memory of what? Bass looked back over his shoulder, gaze heavy, voice steady. Memory that a man they called property walked back into the town that sold him. He said. Memory that he handed a dead man's badge back and walked out alive. He opened the door. Cold morning air rushed in. The street outside had filled with onlookers. Men gripping fence posts, women clutching shawls, children peering around skirts. Silence hit like a physical blow when Bass stepped out. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone whispered, he ain't in chains. Why ain't he in chains? Bass stood at the top of the steps, eyes scanning the crowd. Some faces held hatred. Some held fear. A few, just a few, held something else. Wonder. He descended the steps, boots steady on the worn wood. A man spat near his feet, but stepped back quickly when Bass's gaze brushed him. An older white woman, her hair streaked with gray, muttered, this ain't natural. This ain't right. Beside her, a black man in worn clothes, carrying a sack over his shoulder, stared at Bass with open awe. Bass glanced at him for the briefest moment. Their eyes met. For a second, the man straightened, not much, just enough. Bass gave a small nod. He kept walking. Halfway down the street, a voice cut through the tension. Bass Reeves. He turned. George Reeves sat on a horse at the far end of the road, hat low, eyes burning. Two men flanked him, hands hovering near their weapons. He must have ridden hard. Foam flecked his horse's mouth. The crowd parted like water between them. For a long, suspended moment, master and former slave regarded one another across the space of the street, years of ownership, obedience, humiliation hanging between them like a rope stretched to its limit. George's jaw clenched. You got some nerve, he called. Walking back into my town. Bass's voice carried clear. Ain't your town. George's eyes narrowed. You belong in chains. I belong where my feet choose to stand, Bass replied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. George's face flushed red. You think killin' a handful of fools in the woods make you more than what you are? Bass's gaze didn't waver. I ain't the one sent 'em. George's grip tightened on the reins. You come here to threaten me? Bass shook his head. Already done all the threatenin' I need. George shifted in the saddle, torn between rage and calculation. Shooting Bass in front of witnesses would stain the street with more than blood. It would stain his already fragile reputation. Letting him leave would invite whispers that would never stop. What you want from me? George demanded. Nothing, Bass said quietly. That the part you don't understand. He turned away. George's hand jerked toward his pistol. Every eye in the street watched his fingers close on the grip. Bass's shoulders tightened, but he did not turn. The air crackled. Then George stopped, pulled his hand back. Because in that moment he understood something he would never admit. That even if he killed Bass Reeves in cold blood, he had already lost. The story was bigger than the bullet. George spat into the dust instead. Run then, he bellowed. Run till you drop. You ain't nothin' but a hunted dog. Bass paused at the edge of town, looking out toward the west where the land opened into a rough, promising expanse. I been hunted, he said without looking back. Dog ain't what I am. He walked on. Behind him, Van Buren breathed again. Stories took root. Mothers would whisper his name as warning and promise. White men would spit it like a curse. Slaves would roll it silently on their tongues at night, tasting the idea of a life that did not end under someone else's boot. What Bass did not yet know was that this walk through town, the rifles on his shoulders, the badge dropped like a dead weight on a sheriff's desk, The stare down with the man who once owned him, would haunt Arkansas like a ghost story for decades. They would say he could not be killed. They would say he struck from the trees like thunder. They would say a slave became something the law itself had to reckon with. And they would not be wrong. Bass left Van Buren without looking back. The road leading west unfolded like a long, dusty scar, stretching into land where the law grew thin and memories grew thinner. The morning sun warmed his shoulders, drying the last traces of river fog from his coat. Behind him, murmurs rippled through the town like wind through tall grass. Ahead of him lay the borderlands, wild, harsh, unforgiving. But Bass felt something he had not known in years. Space. Space to breathe. Space to choose. Space where no man's voice sat on his neck like a hand squeezing too tight. He walked for hours, passing farms where children stopped chores to watch him, their small hands stilling mid-task. Some mothers yanked them inside. Others simply stared, suspicion and curiosity blending in their faces like two colors fighting for dominance. At midday, he reached the river ford where wagon tracks curved west toward the territories. He crossed without hesitation. The cold water lapped at his boots, the current tugging his coat, the sun glinting off the rifles across his back. Every step carried him deeper into a world that did not belong to white towns or plantation claims. Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, freedmen, outlaws, drifters, missionaries, trappers. People survived out here not by ownership or status but by skill. Bass had skill. He traveled for 2 days, sleeping in brush thickets, drinking from creeks, following deer trails that twisted through the woods like paths cut by old spirits. The forest here felt different, less haunted by chains, more alive with its own laws. On the 3rd day, he reached a settlement of shacks and canvas tents clustered beside a trading post. The sign hanging crooked from the door read, Gray Buck Trading Company. Men of all colors milled outside, some gambling, some sharpening knives, some arguing over pelts or horseshoes. When Bass approached, silence rippled through the scattered crowd. A few men narrowed their eyes. A few stared openly at the guns. One man, an older black trapper with a limp, watched him with quiet recognition. Bass nodded to him. The trapper nodded back. Inside the trading post, a tall woman with braided hair counted coins behind a plank counter. She glanced up as Bass entered, and her gaze shifted in a way that told him she already knew pieces of the story traveling ahead of him like smoke before a blaze. "You the one walkin' through towns with dead men's guns?" she asked, voice flat but curious. Bass didn't answer. He placed a pouch of coins on the counter, what he'd taken from Riley and the hunters after burying them. "I need food," he said. "Powder. Shot. New boots if you got." She studied him with a careful eye. "I got all that. But men say you bring trouble with you." "Men say lots of things," Bass replied. A faint smirk lifted the corner of her mouth. "You're right. They talk too much." She gathered supplies, setting them on the counter in neat stacks. Flour, dried meat, a flask of oil, a bundle of cloth, a pouch of powder, lead shot. "Boots in the back. Try size 14. Bass raised a brow. "You guessed that." "No," she said. "I see the size of your shadow." Bass didn't smile, but something like respect flickered in his eyes. When he paid, she leaned forward. "Word is men comin' after you. Men paid well." Bass tied the supplies to his pack. "They'll try. You ain't hide." "No." "Then you a fool," she said simply. "But maybe the right kind." Outside, he took his supplies and walked south, away from the road, into the rougher land where trails were nothing but deer paths and memory. 4 months, Bass moved between small settlements, Choctaw camps, trader outposts, and stretches of wilderness that could swallow a man whole. He slept under stars that burned cold and sharp as splintered glass. He crossed ravines filled with fog. He learned which rivers carried good fish and which carried sickness. He learned which towns offered quiet shelter and which offered nothing but trouble. And trouble found him. One night near a derelict creekside cabin, 3 bounty riders tried to surprise him while he slept. Bass woke to the sound of a twig snapping, a sound too crisp, too intentional. He rolled behind a fallen log as a bullet shattered the stump where his head had been. He fired once, hitting the first rider square in the chest. The second rushed him with a knife. Bass caught the man's wrist, twisted, and used the momentum to throw him onto a broken tree root that ended the fight before it truly began. The third fled, leaving his horse behind. Bass stood in the darkness, breath heavy, watching the man disappear between pines. "Go spread it," he murmured. "I ain't dead yet." Word grew, not just of a fugitive, but of something else, something more like a warning carried on the wind. A black man who melted into the land like smoke. A man who hit his mark at impossible distances. A man who walked alone and never left a body behind unless he chose to. Slaves escaping plantations whispered his name at night, asking if he was coming for them. Patrolmen muttered it like a bad omen. White men spat it through clenched teeth. Base Reeves. The law wrote it on posters. Hunters cursed it in camps. Children whispered it to scare each other. Years bled into each other, each one carving him sharper. Hard winters cut his bones but hardened his resolve. Summers baked him under an unforgiving sun. He traded labor for shelter, stories for meals, protection for loyalty. In time he learned more Choctaw, more tricks of the land, more ways to vanish and reappear like a mirage. The frontier did not just shelter him. It shaped him, smoothed him, sharpened him, claimed him. He became a man carved from wilderness, not slave, not fugitive, not shadow. Something else entirely. What Base did not yet know was that his transformation was nearly complete. And soon destiny, history would find him again. Not as prey, but as the law itself. Winter rolled into the territories like a slow-moving beast, cold breath creeping through the pines, frost collecting in delicate webs on grass and bark. Base had lived rough seasons before, but this winter felt different. Sharper. Hungrier. The kind that tested a man's marrow and asked questions he had been avoiding for years. He built his camp deep in a ravine sheltered by leaning boulders, smoke from his fire disappearing into a crack in the stone so no patrol could trace it. At night, the temperature dropped fast enough that his breath hung in the air like ghosts. Base wrapped himself in a stolen wool blanket, chewing dried meat while the flames crackled behind him. Most nights were quiet. Most. Then came the night he heard footsteps. But these steps were light, measured, familiar. Yahola. The Choctaw warrior emerged from the dark, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, a bough slung across his back. Base stood instantly, tension dissolving into recognition. You walk like winter itself, Base murmured. Yahola approached the fire and crouched. And you live like stone. Base allowed a faint smirk. Stone don't break easy. Yahola's dark eyes flicked up. But it does break. Base's expression hardened. You track me? No, Yahola said. Word track you. I follow. Base sat again, tossing a twig into the fire. What word? That you kill more hunters, Yahola said simply. They ain't give me choice. Yahola leaned forward. Always choice. That what Oki told you. Base's jaw tightened. He didn't want this conversation. Not tonight. But Yahola didn't leave him room to avoid it. You stand on edge, Yahola said. Between spirit and shadow. Between justice and revenge. Base stared into the fire, watching the flames lick the logs. You think I don't know that? I think you pretend not to, Yahola answered. Base's fingers curled around his knee. I kill men who ride out with chains. Men who shoot at me first. Men who see me as something less than breath. That ain't revenge. That's survival. Yahola nodded slowly as if weighing every word. Yes, but survival become habit. Habit become purpose. Purpose become hunger. Base looked up sharply. I ain't hungry for killin'. Yahola shrugged. Storm don't choose to rain. It just do. The words hit Base harder than gunfire. He stood abruptly, pacing the narrow camp. Let me ask you something, Base said, voice low. If 5 men come for you with guns, you let 'em live? No. If they come again? 10 of them? No, Yahola said again. So what you a skin of me? Base demanded. Lay down and die so they feel safe? I ask you choose why you kill, Yahola said quietly. Not kill because men push you into corner. Kill because you stand for something. Base turned away. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he exhaled. I don't know what I stand for, he admitted. Yahola's gaze softened. Then you must decide. Base sat slowly. The question hung between them like smoke. What kind of man he would be if he ever stopped running. They stayed in silence until the fire burned low. At dawn, Yahola left. More hunters will come, he warned. Not for revenge. For reputation. They want name. Base nodded. Let him come. I ain't the one dying. But Yahola's final words stuck like splinters. Storm soon. Inside you. Outside you. Choose which you follow. 2 nights later, the storm arrived. Not rain. Not wind. Men. 3 bounty hunters tracked Base to the ravine. They came at twilight, approaching with unusual discipline. Rifles ready, boots soft on frozen ground. These weren't loud men with cheap guns and cheaper morals. These were professionals. Base sensed them before he saw them, the air tightening around his spine. He slipped behind a boulder just as the first shot cracked the silence. The bullet ricocheted off stone, showering him with dust. "Base Reeves," a voice shouted. "We know you here. Won't be no runnin' tonight." Base pulled a pistol from his belt. He didn't fire. Not yet. He waited, breath steady, muscles coiled. 2 men circled left. 1 moved right. They moved like wolves, smart, patient, coordinated. The one on the right crept forward, pausing every few steps to listen. Base slipped behind him, snow muffling his boots. The man froze. Instinct pricked the back of his neck. Base whispered, "Wrong direction." The man spun, gun rising, but Base already had the knife. 1 swift motion. A gasp. A collapse. The second wolf heard the body fall. He swung around, firing blindly. Bullets sparked against stone. Base dropped low, rolled between 2 rocks, and fired once. The shot cracked through the cold air. The man dropped, rifle clattering against the ice. The third hunter approached slower, smarter. Base watched him through a gap in the rocks. He was older, seasoned, eyes sharp. He knew Base was close. He knew panic would get him killed. He moved with cold patience. Base recognized something in the man, competence. Respectable competence. Then the man spoke. "You ain't the only one with ghosts, boy," he called. "I put down men in Kansas, Texas, Missouri. You just another job." Base tightened his grip on the revolver. "But I give you this," the man said. "You good? Ain't many men leave me huntin' this long." Base stepped out from behind the rocks, gun raised. "You talk too much," Base said. The man smirked. "Maybe. But I talk last." He moved, fast. His rifle swung up. Base fired first. The hunter staggered, clutching his chest, breath catching in his throat. He sank to his knees, blood blooming across his coat. He looked up at Base. "You ain't run," the man rasped. "Should've run." Base shook his head. "Done runnin'. The man collapsed backward, snow swallowing the sound. Silence returned to the ravine. Base lowered his gun, chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. 3 bodies lay still. 3 choices made. 3 futures ended. A wind swept through the ravine, stirring powdery snow into pale spirals. Base felt none of its cold. His heart burned too hot. Anger, fear, memory, all knotted into one tight shape inside him. Storm inside. Storm outside. Which one would define him? He walked to the edge of the ravine and looked into the vast, frozen wilderness beyond. Somewhere out there lay a future he had not yet imagined. A future with purpose, not just survival. A future shaped by something he had not allowed himself to believe in. Justice. He whispered into the cold air, "I ain't dyin' in shadows. And I ain't killin' for nothin' no more." For the first time, the storm inside him shifted. Not gentler, but clearer. He knew who he would become. Not prey. Not fugitive. Not ghost. Something else entirely. Something that frightened men with badges, and would one day stand beside them. By the time winter loosened its grip on the borderlands, Base Reeves had carved a life that belonged to no master, no badge, no law but the one he held inside his own chest. He lived between worlds, moving among Choctaw villages where he was welcomed like kin, drifting through outlaw camps where men traded stories of him with equal parts fear and respect, and slipping into quiet settlements where sheriffs pretended not to see him pass. But stories traveled faster than he did. Whispers seeped into Arkansas like smoke under a door. Some said Base Reeves was dead. Some said he had killed 20 men. Some said he had turned into something you didn't see until it was too late. And always, underneath every version, one quiet truth echoed. He had walked into Van Buren and walked out alive. That alone made him myth. But time moved and the world with it. War exploded across the South, brothers fighting brothers, states splitting like rotten wood. Slave patrols thinned. Many plantations emptied as men were dragged into Confederate service. The chaos loosened the chains that had once felt unbreakable. Base watched from a distance, intervening only when the war spilled too close. He didn't fight for the South. He didn't fight for the North. He fought only when innocent people, black, native, or desperate, needed someone to stand between them and violence. And violence always came. One evening, while Base repaired the stock of a rifle in a Choctaw lodge, Yehola entered, face tight. "War men come," Yehola said. "What? Drunk. Armed. They threaten women." Base stood immediately. Together, they moved through the shadows until the firelit center of the settlement came into view. 5 gray-coated deserters shouted insults, waving pistols, overturning baskets of corn and pelts. The youngest warrior in the village gripped a stone knife, teeth clenched. Yehola placed a hand on the boy's arm. "Not your fight." The boy's eyes flicked to Base. Base stepped forward, rifle in hand, not raised, not threatening, simply visible. The deserters turned. One sneered. "Look here. Big man." Another spat. "Black and savage." "Perfect." Base didn't speak. He let silence gather like thunder. The leader swaggered forward. "You gon' move, boy?" Base didn't move. "You deaf." Still silence. The deserter shoved him. Base grabbed the man's wrist so fast the others blinked in confusion. With one fluid twist, he bent the man's arm backward until bone and tendon screamed. The deserter howled. The others raised their pistols. Base spoke only one word. "Don't." Something in his voice, calm, cold, unshakable, cut through whatever liquor or bravado had fueled them. The pistols lowered. The deserters backed away, dragging their wounded leader. They stumbled into the woods, too humiliated to continue posturing. Base released the man and stepped back without another word. The Choctaw boy stared at him with open awe. "Why you not kill?" he whispered. Base looked at the boy. "Because death easy," he said. "And I ain't an easy man no more." Yehola nodded. "Storm choose path." Base felt the truth of it. Storm choose justice. Months passed. Seasons changed. The war grew and died. And then, one warm summer day, everything shifted. Base had been traveling near the western edge of Indian Territory when he heard that federal marshals were recruiting men, black, white, native, to enforce the law across the vast, lawless frontier. Dozens of towns begged Washington for help. Outlaws roamed wild. Murder, theft, raids, violence grew like weeds. Base listened, and something inside him settled. Not a storm. A direction. He rode into Fort Smith, a town buzzing with soldiers, traders, marshals, and fugitives pretending to be innocent men. The fort loomed with its thick wooden palisades, U.S. flags snapping in hot wind. Base dismounted, boots hitting the ground with the slow, deliberate finality of a man walking into a new life. A marshal leaned against a post, chewing tobacco, watching Base approach. "You got business?" he asked. Base met his eyes. "I come to serve a warrant." The marshal snorted. "You? What law you serve?" "My own," Base said. Another marshal, a tall man with sandy hair and a scar along his jaw, stepped beside him. He looked Base over, eyebrows raising at the rifles. "You shoot?" the man asked. Base nodded. "How well?" Base pointed at a small knot in a fence post 30 yards away. "That well." The scar-jawed marshal shrugged. "Go on then." Base lifted his rifle, not braced, not clutched, just held with quiet confidence, and fired once. The shot split the knot dead center. The marshal whistled low. "Hell." A third marshal approached from the doorway. He looked older, thoughtful, the kind of man who had spent years making hard choices. "You him?" the older marshal asked. "Who?" The marshal's eyes sharpened. "The one killed those Arkansas men. The one walked through Van Buren." Base didn't answer. The marshal nodded slowly. "Thought so." He held out a folded paper. "We need deputies that ain't scared of shadows. Need men who know how outlaws think. You interested?" Base took the paper. A badge glinted faintly inside it. Silver, polished, clean. Not like the ones ripped off dead men. Not like the one dropped on Miller's desk. A real badge. Not stolen. Base closed his hand around it for a long moment. Yehola's voice echoed, "Choose why you kill." Oki's voice followed, "Storm, don't ask what you want." Base breathed in slow. The storm inside him had not died. But now he knew where to aim it. He looked at the marshal. "What work you expect of me?" The marshal shrugged. "Hunt killers. Catch thieves. Bring in men no one else can." Base nodded once. "That I can do." He pinned the badge to his chest. It gleamed like dawn breaking over a dark river. Years later, people would tell stories about Base Reeves, the lawman, the tracker, the man who walked into danger alone and dragged criminals back by their collars. They would forget the plantation boy. They would forget the hunted fugitive. They would forget the 13 riders who never returned. They would forget the blood that watered the roots of his legend. But the forest remembered. The river remembered. And somewhere in Arkansas, beneath leaves that never stopped growing, the bones of those who chased him lay still, silent witnesses to the truth of his rise. Was every tale true? No. Many were exaggerations, half-truths, or folklore polished by retellings. But one thing was certain. Before Base Reeves wore a badge of honor, he survived the badge of death. Before he became the law, he outran it. Before he stood for justice, he tore himself free from men who tried to own his breath, his bones, and his story. Some say he was a ghost. Some say he was a storm. Some say he was the first lawman the Wild West truly feared. Maybe he was all three. And maybe that is why his legend still burns. What do you think of this story? Was Bass driven more by revenge, justice, or the need to prove he could never be owned again? Leave your interpretation in the comments. If you want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to the Slave Rebellion. Hit the bell so you never miss a new tale, and share this video with someone who loves stories that blur the line between history and myth. These stories must be remembered. These voices must be heard. See you in the next video.